Imagine it is the cold morning of December, 1849. The air in St. Petersburg is a jagged blade of ice cutting through your lungs. You are standing on a raised wooden platform in Semyonovsky Square, surrounded by a crowd of silent, stone-faced soldiers. You are only 28 years old. Your name is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Just 3 years ago, you were hailed as the new genius of Russian literature, after your debut novel Poor Folk took the city by storm. But today you are not a celebrated author. You are a state criminal. You and your fellow prisoners are dressed in long white peasant smocks. They look like nightgowns, but they are actually funeral shrouds. 3 of your friends have already been tied to the pillars. Their eyes are covered with blindfolds. You are in the next group. You watch as the soldiers raise their rifles and take aim. You begin to calculate the exact math of your death. You decide you have maybe 5 minutes left to live. You spend 2 minutes saying goodbye to the friends standing next to you. You spend 2 minutes thinking about your life, and you save the final minute just to look at the world one last time. You look up at the cross of the cathedral reflecting the morning sun. You realize that in 60 seconds you will become part of that light. You will be nothingness. Your heart is hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. But then, the unthinkable happens. Just as the commanding officer is about to shout the word fire, a carriage gallops into the square. A messenger leaps out waving a white envelope. The rifles are lowered. The soldiers stand down. It was a trick. A cruel psychological experiment orchestrated by Tsar Nicholas I. The death sentences had been commuted to hard labor in Siberia weeks ago, but the Tsar wanted to break your spirit before he broke your body. He wanted you to feel the cold breath of the grave. At that moment, one of your companions goes permanently insane from the shock. But you, Dostoevsky, look at the world and feel a terrifying surge of joy. You realize that every second is 1 trillion rubles of wealth that you had been throwing away. This was the birth of a prophet. This was the moment the old Dostoevsky died, and the man who would decode the human soul was born. Welcome to the Lighthouse. Here we navigate the complexities of history, one story at a time. Today we are stepping onto that frozen scaffold in 1849 to understand how a mock execution and the high-stakes politics of a police state turned a young socialist into the most profound novelist in history. Understand why a young writer was being fitted for a funeral shroud. We have to look at the terrifying atmosphere of Russia under Tsar Nicholas I. This was a man known as the Iron Ruler. His philosophy was built on 3 pillars: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. In his Russia, thinking was a dangerous hobby. Books were not just stories, they were contraband. The secret police were everywhere, and the censors were so paranoid that they once banned a textbook on arithmetic because the dots between the numbers looked like a secret code. Dostoevsky was part of a secret group called the Petrashevsky Circle. They weren't terrorists with bombs. They were intellectuals with books. They would gather on Friday nights to drink tea and discuss the utopian ideas of French thinkers like Charles Fourier and Saint-Simon. They dreamed of a world without serfdom, a world where the peasant was not a piece of property but a human being. In any other country, this would be a book club. In Nicholas I's Russia, it was treason. The specific spark that led to the scaffold was a piece of forbidden literature. Dostoevsky had committed the ultimate sin. He had publicly read Vissarion-Belinsky's famous letter to Gogol. To understand the weight of this, you have to understand the players. Nikolai Gogol was the giant of Russian letters, the man who wrote Dead Souls. But late in his life, Gogol became deeply conservative and religious. Belinsky, the great radical critic, was furious. He wrote a scorching letter accusing Gogol of betraying the Russian people and defending a corrupt church. When Dostoevsky read this letter to the Circle, he wasn't just sharing an opinion. He was participating in a ritual of rebellion. In a country where the press is dead, literature becomes the only battlefield. The Tsar's spies were listening. To the government, these young men were not just readers, they were a virus. The year was 1848, and revolutions were toppling kings across Europe. Nicholas I was terrified that the fire would spread to Russia. So he decided to make an example of them. He didn't just want to punish them. He wanted to perform a piece of state theater that would haunt the Russian intelligentsia for a generation. This tension between the gentleman author and the secret police is what gave birth to the social novel. Writers realized that if they wanted to talk about the truth, they had to hide it inside the psychology of their characters. They had to make their politics invisible. Dostoevsky was arrested in the middle of the night and thrown into the Peter and Paul fortress. For 8 months, he sat in a damp stone cell waiting for a sign. He had no idea that his trial was a sham, or that his execution was a script written by the Tsar himself. He only knew that his life as a rising star in the literary salons was over. He was about to enter the House of the Dead, but first he had to survive those 3 minutes on the scaffold that would rewrite his DNA. When the rifles were lowered and the blindfolds were ripped off, the man who stood on that scaffold was no longer the same Fyodor Dostoevsky who had entered the square. Those 3 minutes of eternity had rewired his brain. In the silence of that frozen morning, he had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back. To understand the Dostoevskian intensity that defines his later masterpieces, you have to understand the specific sensory shock of that moment. Dostoevsky later described this experience through the character of Prince Mishkin in his novel, The Idiot. Mishkin tells a story of a man being led to the scaffold who is obsessed with a single thought. What if I did not have to die? What if I could go back? I would turn every minute into an age of wealth. I would not waste a single breath. This was not just literary fiction. This was Dostoevsky's psychological reality. Before the execution, he was a dreamer, interested in the external world and social justice. After the execution, he became an explorer of the internal world. He realized that human beings are not rational creatures driven by simple needs. We are creatures of the underground, full of contradictions and dark corners. Think about the sun reflecting off that cathedral dome in 1849. For Dostoevsky, that light became a symbol of a reality that most of us are too asleep to see. He began to write with a frantic, desperate energy, as if every sentence was a stay of execution. This is why his characters always seem to be living in a state of high fever. They are all standing on their own personal scaffolds, waiting for the firing squad of fate. This trauma transformed his socialist ideals into something much more complex. He saw that the utopia his friends in the Petrashevsky circle were dreaming of was too thin. It didn't account for the soul. It didn't account for the fact that a human being might choose to suffer or even to destroy themselves just to prove they are free. He walked away from that square knowing that the secret of existence is not just to stay alive, but to find something worth dying for. The Tsar's mercy was its own kind of hell. Instead of the bullet, Dostoevsky was given 4 years of hard labor in a Siberian prison camp, followed by years of forced military service. He was shackled in 5-pound iron chains that were never removed even when he slept. He lived in a barracks with mass murderers and common thieves. This was his House of the Dead. But it was here, among the lowest of humanity, that Dostoevsky found the seeds of his greatest moral arguments. He realized that the intellectual elites, like Ivan Turgenev, or the radical Alexander Herzen, who theorized about the people from their comfortable villas in Europe, didn't actually know the people at all. Dostoevsky saw that even in the most brutal criminal there was a flicker of the divine. He saw that suffering was not just a social problem to be solved by a new law, but a spiritual furnace that could forge a new soul. This realization reaches its absolute peak in his final and greatest work, The Brothers Karamazov. In the famous chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky pits 2 worldviews against each other. On one side is the Inquisitor, who argues that humanity is too weak to handle the burden of freedom and should be traded for bread and security. On the other side is the silent Christ, who offers nothing but the terrifying beauty of free choice. Dostoevsky was writing from experience. He knew that the Tsar and the secret police were essentially Grand Inquisitors trying to protect Russia by taking away its freedom. But he also knew that the socialists, who promised a bread-filled utopia, were doing the exact same thing. He saw that the only answer to the acts of the state was the active love practiced by the character Father Zosima. Contrast this with the work of his rivals. While Leo Tolstoy was writing grand historical narratives about the movement of armies in war and peace, Dostoevsky was writing about the movement of a single soul under the pressure of a death sentence. While the wealthy elite discussed aesthetics in the salons of 1864, Dostoevsky was asking the ultimate question. If God does not exist, is everything permitted? He concluded that without a moral anchor, the freedom promised by the radicals would inevitably lead to the firing squads he had faced in 1849. He turned his personal mock execution into a universal warning. He was telling us that the cost of a life is infinite, and that we only truly begin to live when we acknowledge the darkness within us and choose the light anyway. So what is the ultimate legacy of those 3 minutes on the Semyonovsky Square? Dostoevsky did not just survive a mock execution. He decoded a fundamental truth about what it means to be human. He realized that most of us are walking through our lives in a state of spiritual sleep. We worry about our social status, our bank accounts, and our petty grievances as if we have an eternity to waste. But for Dostoevsky, the firing squad is always there. It is just invisible. He spent the rest of his life trying to wake us up. He wanted us to understand that being is not the same as existing. To exist is to simply occupy space and follow the rules of the state or the economy. To truly be is to embrace the terrifying freedom of the soul. This is the living towards death philosophy that predated the great existentialists of the 20th century. He proved that the only way to find the light is to first acknowledge the total darkness of the pit. We are surrounded by digital surveillance and a culture that promises us bread and security in exchange for our attention. And our agency. We are often tempted to believe that if we just follow the right algorithm or buy the right product, we can escape the underground. But Dostoevsky reminds us that the human condition is messy, contradictory, and beautiful, precisely because it cannot be solved by a formula. The mock execution of 1849 was a cruel act of state theater, but it backfired in the most magnificent way possible. Instead of breaking a reeb, it created a visionary. It gave Dostoevsky the eyes to see the divine in the criminal and the miracle in the mundane. He taught us that even when the rifles are aimed at your heart, you can still choose to love the world. As he wrote in his final days through the voice of Father Zosima, "Love all God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything." This wasn't cheap sentimentality. This was a command from a man who had felt the cold wood of the pillar against his back and still decided that life was a gift beyond measure. Thanks for joining me today at the Lighthouse. If you liked today's journey into the feverish mind of Dostoevsky, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep exploring the stories that illuminate the human soul in its darkest hours. See you at the next Lighthouse.